Welcome to the 23rd reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Secondary School. After the summer holidays, I went back to a secondary school. In assembly one morning at St. George's, I had copied the girls adjacent to me by putting up my hand for Wilson marriage at the top of Hythe Hill, not far from a messy part of the River Cone, a run-down part of town. I could have chosen St. Helena on Sheepen Road, but I didn't know one school from the other and hadn't discussed it with my parents beforehand. A poor choice in the future, location-wise, but at the time it mattered not at all. On the first day of classes, I proudly wore my new school uniform, grey wrap-over pinafore skirt, white blouse, navy blue and gold striped tie, and grey cardigan. Boys' black lace-up shoes on my feet, Mum's insistence, as they lasted longer than girls' shoes. I carried a vinyl-trimmed canvas school satchel from Woolworths, not a leather one, which I preferred, but Mum couldn't afford. I started out in Form 1A, the highest class for my age level, due to my reading and writing ability, but a few weeks later after tests I was moved into the next class down, Form 1B, where I didn't know any of the girls. At least I didn't get thoroughly demoted to the lowest level of all, as there were none other than 4 streams ranging from A to D. My English language skills would keep me near the top, but as always, my problem with maths took me nearer to the bottom. I would be forever bored with English classes and forever lost with maths classes. A difficult child to fit into a curriculum, as whatever my problems were, no one at that time in the history of education who made contact with me appeared to have heard of it. As school stood, Wilson marriage towered giant size, a red brick Victorian monstrosity. Every morning we all trooped up the stone stairs 2 by 2, boys in one entrance, girls in the other, carefully scrutinized by prefects who picked on you and sent you to the headmaster's office if you as much as whispered on the stairs. The small amount of power they acquired obviously went to their heads, as they took great pleasure in catching us out in any way possible. We assembled in the school hall in rows, boys on the right, girls on the left. Teachers positioned themselves all around the hall to prevent our escape. Announcements from the headmaster up on stage with the other head teachers preceded hymn singing, scripture reading and prayers. I often read out the scripture for the day, but always found it stressful. The school orchestra accompanied us during hymn singing, the only part of assembly I enjoyed. I tried playing recorder with the orchestra, but quit because of nerves. I loved the words of the hymns. They flowed into me, caressing my heart. The recognition of creation in all things bright and beautiful, the vision of faraway places in Greenland's icy mountains, the call to Christian duty in Onward Christian Soldiers, the bittersweet sorrow of Christ's death in There is a Green Hill Far Away, the promise of a bountiful harvest in We Plough the Fields and Scatter, the magic of a special birth in Away in a Manger, and I adored William Blake's Jerusalem. The hymn that touched me the most, though, was My Song is Love Unknown. The line, "Love to the loveless shown, that they might lovely be," cried out to my sense of aloneness. This emotion I kept hidden from the girls who stood beside me. All the first-year pupils were asked to raise their hands if they were in choir at their previous school. I didn't want to lie, so I kept my hand down and struck myself a cruel blow in the process. I inadvertently signed myself up for 4 years of grieving, for I would never be allowed to audition for the choir. The majority of my class trooped off to choir practice. I stayed behind with the children who took no interest in singing, a handful of boys and one other girl. My past caught up with me, in that Valerie remembered me from North Street Junior because of my reading for Mr. Fuchs. We had nothing else in common, other than desperately wanting to be in the choir. It pained me to hear the music drifting in from the hall. I memorized every song they sang, even the harmony parts. I could have filled in for any one of them at a moment's notice. I became the perpetual understudy, always waiting to be let on stage for my chance to shine. Forgetting, however, that anxiety usually drew a black curtain over any brightness that dared to burst forth. Maths class continued to be my worst nightmare. Lacking remedial help, I fell behind, lost in a strange land of numbers, and later on confusing symbols when faced with algebra. My teacher held me up as a bad example to the rest of the class. I always answered 0 to each question on my test papers because I'd given up. And so he would say in a weary voice at the beginning of each test, "Stand up, Jennifer Barrow." And I would stand up, knowing full well what to expect. In his hand he'd hold my last test paper, result a big fat 0, and would pronounce in the same weary voice, "This is a perfect example of what I do not want you to achieve in this test." Then tell me to sit down while the whole class sniggered at me. At one point, in sheer desperation, I asked Dad to help me with my maths homework, but when I failed to grasp his explanation, he gave up, thumped his fist down on the table and shouted, "You're impossible. I'm never helping you again." He didn't have to. I didn't ask him. English was where I shone, with my love of poetry and the ability to cover pages and pages of lined paper with words. When assigned a composition, I happily wrote on while everybody else handed in their finished work. My teacher allowed me extra time in which to finish my stories, letting me off other work she knew I'd already grasped. I managed to succeed in English without putting much effort into it. That first year, I won the English prize for the lower school, beating out the A-stream children, proving I was capable of handling a higher standard of work. I also won the poetry prize and gained an unwelcome fan following from some poetry lovers who came up to me in the playground. "Are you the Jennifer Barrow who writes poetry?" one of them said. I blushed, embarrassed that their teachers had discussed me with them and read out my poetry in class. Allowing anxiety to gain the upper hand, I slunk away and no doubt disappointed them. Some role model I was. Why didn't I start a poetry club for them and gain some like-minded friends? Unfortunately, much of what I wrote incorporated indirect cries for help. Poems and stories depicting deprivation and loneliness, homeless children and stray dogs wandering the streets searching for love, clues to the reality of my lonely existence. After each submitted story, I waited for my English teacher to probe the reason behind a certain phrase or particular subject. Out of all my teachers, she would be the one to understand, but she never deciphered the clues. Although her academic favourite, as I had been Mr. Fuchs's favourite, the attention I received was conditional, dependent on my gift. I wanted something more, a relationship. I soon realized that creating stories from my heart achieved nothing along those lines. A short phase of deliberate, badly written compositions, sloppy work and poor handwriting ensued. Rebellion. Chastised, I reluctantly settled back into my lonely role of English class freak. Still, I continued to suffer frustration from the lack of connection with my teacher. A group of girls in my class bullied me constantly, and I longed to share this problem with her, but found no avenue for doing it. One day I couldn't take the taunts any longer, and ran out into the hallway towards the cloakroom, colliding into her by accident. I immediately burst out crying and took off down the hall. She followed, and relief flooded over me because I thought I could tell her everything. Let all the pain out and she would understand and want to help me, because she couldn't let me suffer anymore, not if she cared. It didn't happen. She probably thought I cried because of a transgression. Severely reprimanded and sent off to the headmaster's study for another lecture on how to behave at school, I gave up again on ever letting her into my heart. Back into its lonely interior I crept, where I imagined nobody would ever find me. My prize-winning poem was an answer to a poem by Frances Cornford, To a Fat Lady Seen from the Train. Cornford asks a simple question of the woman. She wants to know why she is wearing gloves. My reply to her question in my poem was that I, the fat white woman, bought the gloves because they were made from bright red leather and they cheered me up. I couldn't be jeered or shamed that day because the wearing of the gloves made me feel like a princess. I wrote, "Then came the train that ruined my day." The person who yelled from the train window was mistaken. I was loved by the nature surrounding me. The bees and the flowers, the insects and doves all welcomed me with their sweet song. I finished with a plea to the person in the train. I said to him or her, "If we meet again, please have some care. I was once young like you, and far from insane, till I first noticed white in my hair." At the award ceremony, the headmaster stood up and read those last two lines to the audience. He said he was moved by the depth of them, the words and the meaning behind them older than my years. If he asks me, I would tell him why I can identify with a woman who has so little in her life that a simple pair of red gloves can lift her spirits and bring her joy. If he asks me, I would tell him what it feels like to be jeered at and scorned, and how painful it is to be lonely and misunderstood. If he asks me, I would tell him how I can sense what insanity is, because I believe it is that sense of isolation from humanity the woman in my poem is experiencing. If he asks me, I would tell him that in so many words, she, the misunderstood character in Frances Cornford's poem, is me, struggling to find her way out of the confines of the verse, attempting to be found. But he didn't. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.